Look at that. What did you just see? You can blame this on my son. He basically pointed out that my videos are not very well structured, not very well organized. So if you actually want to find something out about a particular subject, it's virtually impossible. And it's true, because none of my videos were meant to be how-tos. They were more about sharing the experience and having you guys kind of come along. So I need to rectify some of that, and especially in the area 372, since that's a favorite saw of mine. And so I think this video is the beginning of that. And where it starts is this, I've always wanted a small mount version. And Bob provided to me the holy grail of that whole 372 chassis series saw, and that's a 2063 Jonsered. Does that sound confusing? Well, it shouldn't if you follow the channel, because you should recognize that the fundamentals of the Jonsered 70 series of saws, the 2063 through 2071 all the way up to the 2172, are all derivatives of the 372 Husqvarna designs, right? Now the second thing is I'm going to have to do this in fits and starts. Is I've been quite ill for actually several weeks. Coming out the other end of that, realized life can't stop. You got to continue. So this is also the beginning of my summer season with chainsaws as well. We have a couple of themes here. One I'm not going to bellyache about, and that's the recovery. And the second is reviewing the whole 372 class of saws. Now I've done this, but my God, it's spread over so many videos that it's almost impossible for people to dig through and find the relevant bits and pieces. And I may go back into the archives, because I've got some photographs and some videos of just about every single iteration of Husqvarna 372 Jonsered comparable models that existed, except for two. And I've got both the ones I missed here on the table today. Like I said, the one was the small mount version, in this case the 2063, and the other was an original 371 in its original form. And here's a 371. Now, I'm not going to go off into the weeds too quickly, but one of the things you're going to notice on the original 371 version of the 372 chassis is, look where the chain adjuster is. It's in the front of the case, not in the side cover. So of course we're going to have to adapt that. So that's a difference between the 371 and 372. Another difference between 371 and 372 was they started out with a very lightweight flywheel, which by the way I use those to hop up later versions of 372 because they have less mass, but they cool well enough for my climate. They might not cool well enough for Arizona, but for New York State they do. And another thing that the 371 had that the 372 didn't was a single ring piston versus the double ring pistons, which came fairly quickly after. Here's a 371 piston with a single ring, and this is what the 372 had. And they blended. There's some early 372s that had that single ring and all that. I'm not going to get into the serial numbers and all that, just general concepts here, please. But that's a 371 single ring. This is a 372 where they added a second ring. I don't know if you can see some other differences from the Hilltop Saw Shop world. The observant ones will figure that out. The other ones won't. And that whole 372 class saw progressed, making changes. You know, they evolved. Different ignition here, different carburetor there. You know, one of the things that evolved also was the crankshafts, but I'll get into that a little bit later. And eventually the 372 came to an end as a US sold product somewhere around 2009, 2010. where a completely new design saw hit the marketplace, and that was called the 372 XP. Well, wait a minute, it has the same number as the 372 XP the year before, but as I've said over and over again, it's a completely different saw design, and it's really hard to argue that they're the same saw. It was a different design pretty much from the cases up, and the heart of the new design was this basic cylinder right here, which was a completely different cylinder design than the original 372, 371 series. And the differences are rather significant. Oh, I got a doctor's appointment. So got back from the doctor and moving forward, and I was talking about the historical roots of the 372 series and talking about one of my project saws, which is on the periphery of the block and tackle 372 evolution. So this is what I want to do, I think, is I'm going to do it in a series of videos, but this picture right here will save me a lot of talking. And basically what you have in my mind is you have the first group of saws above that line are original edition, and that would be the 371 that would turn into a 372 with a case change and a piston change and a few other things, flywheel, stuff like that. Details don't matter. And then that chassis spawned a 362, 365 special, and then 372, right? And really the 362 was kind of an oddball deal. It had a small mount versus a large mount cases, but it also had an open port versus a closed port cylinder. And then the 365 special was the 48 millimeter top end that I know and love. I did a saw on that a couple years back. Love those top ends. They're closed port. They're meant for a little bit lower RPM. And in the conventional logic, that means something bad. In fact, it turns out to be good. And of course, the standard original edition 372 50 millimeter top end. And then they had another version. It started out being called the 375, and they quickly changed that to a 372 XPW. And instead of 50 millimeter, it was a 51.4 millimeter bore top end, closed port, but it had restricted transfers to bring the RPMs down. And again, if you go by online logic, that's a bad thing. I've gone through that enough for you guys to realize it's not a bad thing. It's just moving the power band based on the cross-sectional area of the transfers. Now, while the Husqvarna line laid out something like that, and there were some variations. For example, there was low top versions of the 372 that were sold more overseas, and then there's a high top versions. And of course the XPW was supposed to be for the more West Coast longer bar types, you know, more bore, more torque, longer bar, you know, not quite as many RPMs, but enough. But alongside the Husky line, then you had the Jonsered line, and you had the 2063, which is what this is. And like the 362, it has a little smaller bore, and I'm not sure on that cylinder yet if it's an open or closed port, but it's different. But the big difference between the 2063 and the other versions of that saw is small mount bar versus a large mount bar. And of course the 2065, 2071, and that evolved into the 21 series. And in particular, we did a 2165 on the channel, and we've done 2171s as well. For that matter, I called it a 2175 because I put a 51.4 XPW top end on a 2171 bottom end. Those were all original edition. And I'll go through this several times, and I already have. My God, I've got video after video doing that. It was just what my son pointed out is I can't go back and pinpoint them because I usually have these longer videos, and all that information is buried in there somewhere. So right around 2009, a new design came out. It was called the X-Torq. And as I was showing before, instead of the original edition style cylinder, you got this thing right here. And it's just all different. There's a lot of parts interchangeability if you're clever, but you really have to know what you're doing. So this is the X-Torq cylinder. It's obviously quite a bit different than the original edition 50 millimeter. It's also 50 millimeter. But it's all different, you know. You've got more thin area. It's taller by 1/2 inch. The location of the decomp is different. There's just all kinds of differences. And the big thing with the intake, you have a completely different casting for the intake side. You've got the straddle ports, and you have different layout for transfers. You've got caps on the cylinder versus no caps. About the only thing that's the same is the pattern on the bottom of the cylinder, so it'll sit on the cases, and the muffler. It's about the only thing that's the same. Pretty much everything else is different between the X-Torq. So I don't really consider that the same saw. It's a different saw. Now, because this is a completely different design, right? Really, they had to make some substantial changes. So the new design required some substantial changes. It retained the model number from the original edition saw, completely different design. And the 365, I think they dropped the special. They just call it a 365. They may call it a special, I don't remember. But basically, these two saws are virtually identical. And the only real difference between the X-Torq 365 and 372 is the cap, where they restricted the flow in the transfer port, and some plastic. Basically, the 365 is a low top configuration, where the 372 sold in the States was all high tops. Between the transfer caps being restricted and having a somewhat restricted intake because of the smaller air filter and smaller top cover, the 365 made a little bit less power. Not that many people would notice, but it does. We've gone into that again. Now, the Jonsereds are all low tops, so they were the same as a 365. The air filters are the same, everything else. But they had completely different plastic. I did a video on that once before. And while the cases and all the hard parts swap between the two brands, because of the pull start, because of the angle of the handlebar and stuff like that, things like the tank handle and the top covers and the handlebar are pretty much unique to Jonsered. And they have the 2166, the 2172. Jonsered went out of business, turned to Red Max. On the Husqvarna side, they actually came up with another set of cases, a bunch of more improvements. And then while the 372 X-Torq had a pretty rocky start, we'll get into that another time, the new ones are pretty solid. They've debugged them to the point where if you buy one of those, it's a good non-auto-tuned 70cc pro-level saw, and you won't have any problem with it. Same with the 365. So that's an overview of the models. Doing this because I'm getting old. Because of the cylinder design, I'm just going to show this picture up here. These are some of the differences. But because of the different cylinder design, they had to make a lot of, I think, rather substantial changes to the saw. And again, it's taller. So since the cylinder itself is taller, the top cover had to be changed. They added like a 1/2 inch to it. Since the decomp had this top location, they had to add this little dimple up here. So that top cover, you put it on an original edition, you got a lot more space on top of the fins. Oh, gotta go. So back again, and the quick overview of this is, again, the Husqvarna family tree, which started with a 371 turned 372. 372 was broken to a 362 small mount, 365 special that had low top, 48 millimeter cylinder, and a few other changes. And then the 372 XP, which had the 50 millimeter cylinder like this. This is a 50 millimeter 372. And I think I showed you before that there were some differences between 371 and 372. Things like a single ring piston on the 371 to the double ring piston 50 millimeter on 372. And then you had the XPW, which was a 51.4 millimeter cylinder with a slightly closed off transfer to bring the RPMs down. So you can see the difference in the bore and the transfers, right? So we covered that, and I've done that many times over the years in the videos. Still original edition, so I prefer them. And the other thing is the 365, I did a video on that one showing it also had smaller transfers than the 372 50 millimeter XP cylinder. This one here had the largest transfers of all of them, the original editions, and is probably the best top end to build with. You know, for most people, starting with one of these is probably the best way to go. And then it all changed. 2009, 2010, the original edition, both from Husqvarna and from Jonsered, came to an end. And a whole new cylinder was designed, and they didn't change the model number, so a 372 XP, most people don't realize that they have a completely different saw if they have a 2010 through now versus the original edition. They bought them, they expected the same kind of a saw, and the fact was it was a different design from the get-go. Because of the different cylinder design, there's a lot of things that got changed on the saw. It's taller. It's got more fins, so it's heavier. Completely different intake. It has additional passages for the straddle ports. And the cross-sectional area of the transfers are, I don't know, somewhat less. So they rev at a slower RPM. One of the reasons, as an aside, that I like going the XPW top end on the X-Torq lower units, the X-Torq bottom ends, is because both of them have a little bit larger piston and both of them run a little bit lower RPM. These here, the way they're set up, they like to run around 13,000 RPMs no load. I guess the spec is 13.3. Whereas this design right here with the larger transfers is like 13,500 versus the 13,300 on the X-Torq. They just simply like to rev more. Now understand, no load is a reference for tuning, it's not time and cut. But because of this completely different cylinder, just the entire saw had to be changed in order to accommodate that design. Everything from the cover being taller, the handle being taller, the chain brake handle being taller, all this stuff had to accommodate the taller cylinder. And while you could retro a lot of the X-Torq parts back to the original edition, there are certain things on the original edition you can't retro forward to the X-Torqs. One of the very subtle things, and again, I've done this before, is when they went to the X-Torq, they actually had to change the casting of the cases right here because this flange is longer on the X-Torq than on the original edition by quite a bit. I don't know if the camera will show, but you're looking at, I don't know, 100,000s or more. So while you can put the original edition cylinder on the newer X-Torq cases, you really can't put these on the original edition cases unless you take back some of this material right here to make clearance so it can actually sit inside the case. Because otherwise what would happen is the flange will interfere with the bottom here on the original edition cases. So the cases are different between the original edition saws and the X-Torq saws. Although if you buy a set of cases for original edition saws now, you're going to get the X-Torq cases because they retro back. So that's a very subtle thing. And the discussion can just go in a million different ways. And I already mentioned that the difference between the 372 and the 365 is the transfer ports, high top versus low top, and stuff like that. But there are a lot of other things that happened with this design change that's not readily obvious. Okay, we talked about the top cover, the handle, the chain brake, and all the things related to the intake, because it's a different carburetor intake boot, filter holder, and things like that, right? But we didn't talk about crankshaft. One of the things that Husqvarna had to deal with is the fact that now with a new cylinder, you have a heavier piston. So now the entire balance of the crank and bottom end is different because you have more weight sitting right here. And some of the earlier X-Torques, they had that PTO side bearing issue. Some of it related just simply they were revving high because people were trying to make them sound like the older versions. And no matter what you did to the tuning screw, you could never make the X-Torques rev as high as the standard 372 XP original edition. Just simply couldn't do it. Number one is because the ignition systems on the X-Torques were rev limited to 13.3, where the ignition systems on the original edition were 13.5 or higher. So that sound was going to be different simply because the RPMs were going to be different. And as an aside, one of the things that used to create problems for dealers was a person who got the adjustment tool for the carburetor and would keep trying to lean out the X-Torques to make it spin like an original edition. And eventually that creates problems, you know? And we found pretty much early on that if you set these to about 13,000 RPMs no load, the X-Torques, even the early ones lasted pretty well if you brought the RPMs down. And I think it was a variety of factors, but I think one of the key issues is just not having that additional mass as a piston just beating on the bottom end. Now, over the years, if you start looking at the crankshafts, you're going to see that pin right there change as they alter the balance. They sort of evolve the crankshaft over time. And the wrist pin on the piston got different as well, so they basically kept changing bits and pieces of the crankshaft and the wrist pin and the piston itself until they got the balance back. At least that's a speculation, because they did change over the years. You look at a new crankshaft versus the original ones that came with the first 2010s, and they are different. Wrist pins, I think they were pretty small, pretty thin early on, but a lot of that was just trying to maintain the balance so that bottom end didn't have to deal with additional vibration because of the heavier piston. So just lots and lots of things had to be adjusted and changed to accommodate that new design. And the resultant saw was a heavier saw. So, you know, was it an improvement? I don't know. They do run good, no doubt. I would say that the X-Torque is a great way to start if you want to modify saws, because you've got the caps. Remember, you have caps that you can take off, whereas the old ones here, you had to get a fairly sophisticated die grinder to get in there on those transfer ports, where this right here you can just work right from the sides. So these, I think, are easier to modify. And like them or not, these damn things can run. Do the right kind of things to these. They just freaking run. So that's an overview of the lineage, the models, an overview between original edition and X-Torque. We're going to do that several times in several different ways. And as I get into future videos, I'm going to drill down on things like the differences in the crankshafts and the differences in the cases. In fact, I've done that in the past. Suffice to say that these are what they sell now, number one. There's a gazillion of them out there, number two. There's an awful lot of people who got rid of these top ends for original edition top ends when you did conversions, and that created a whole new set of problems, by the way. So these are a little bit easier to work with, I think. By the way, one of the issues, I've seen it a gazillion times, one of the things that happens is you put an original edition cylinder in place of one of these. There's a lot of space underneath that top cover now, you know. The cooling is not quite as good because the air just goes right over the top as compared to being forced through the fins. And there's less fins to begin with. So in the northern climates it doesn't matter so much. In the southern climates you might want to think about that twice. One of the modifications I like to do on these, to modify the intake boot and put an X-Torque carburetor on it. I've done that a bunch of times. You've seen it in the videos. It actually works. You got to sort of clean up the intake port and cut that, like I said before. So there's just a lot of really simple things a person can do to make those runs stronger if you want to. Not going to get into that. I've covered most of what I want to do, but to those guys who are going to make them spin, there's a few of you guys out there who are discovering 372 for the first time, it sounds like, on the videos. I'm going to caution you, careful with the crank. Pick the right crank. You know, learn a little bit about what's out there, and absolutely avoid the aftermarket cranks. And make sure that you get one of the later cranks. You can see right here the slight changes. Get one of the later 372 X-Torq cranks if you're going to modify an X-Torq cylinder to make it run more RPMs. You want to really pay attention to that balance. If you're starting with a later model saw, like 2016, 17 and later, it's a non-issue. But if you got one of the earlier X-Torques, you know, like the 2010 through 14, you might want to consider finding a, I don't care if it's used or new, late model crank. You know, I think you'll find that's going to serve you better, especially if you put on a unlimited ignition and start trying to get, you know, higher RPMs out of your saw. Now, along with all this stuff, one of the big differences between the X-Torques and the older saws is the ignition system, and this is something that's overlooked. The first generation of those saws, they had troubles. They had a hard time getting them started. And they came up with an ignition system, I don't know, somewhere around 2016 or 17, where it actually started creating spark at a much lower RPM, plus a slightly different timing curve. It's a blue limited ignition, so all the hot rod guys weren't interested in it. But that ignition system basically was a huge improvement to make the X-Torq start. Number one, it didn't take as many RPMs to start making a good hot spark, so it was easier to get them to pull over and fire off. And I would say that that is one of the biggest changes in that series of saw, and I've used those in the original editions with good results, especially with a 365 or an XPW where you don't have the higher RPMs anyway. I know this is getting into the weeds, but it needs to be said. If I'm going to go back to an original edition and I don't want to make major changes to a saw, and I've got a late model X-Torq, these cylinders, the XPWs and the 48 millimeters, like I did a couple years back, they really suit the chassis because of that ignition system, and also because this one here also has a little bit larger piston, so it balances well on the X-Torq crank and in the wrist pin and stuff like that. It's a nice balance, and the cylinder, because of the smaller cross-sectional area of the transfers, matches up really nice to the ignition system. Now, the real horsepower guys don't care about that, but the rest of us do. And so you can bring one of the X-Torques back to original edition and end up with a nice running saw. And I would get rid of the cover. You know, there's a lot of options out there from either Chinese or used OEM to bring that cover down so you don't lose the cooling capability. You want to force the air through the fins instead of having to go over the top. You know, stuff like that you got to consider. Now, I'm getting off into the weeds. Getting new parts to go on the original edition saws. I don't have a problem having the taller handle on the original edition 372. That works fine. The only part that I really have a problem with is the top cover, like I said, and that's because of the clearance over the cylinder for cooling. Pretty much everything else. So it's a little taller chain brake paddle, who cares? A little taller handle, well, it gives me more room when I have a glove on. Actually, it's not a bad thing, you know what I'm saying? The carburetor intake, that's another discussion. Basically, I modify a OEM original edition boot so I can rotate it to deal with the new carburetors. And the problem I've had with those is it kind of kinks the throttle cable. You'll have to go back to my older videos to see how I solved that. But it can be done. There's a lot of cross-compatible parts when you go from X-Torq back. There's less going forwards. So for example, the short handle on an X-Torq is a real pain because you can't get a gloved hand underneath between the handle and the top cover, but the taller X-Torq handle in original edition works just fine. We'll get into that. Back to my subject at hand. Let me put some of this stuff away. Just so you can see yet again, here's a brand new, out of the box, 372 XP original edition cylinder. Here's a used, modified by me, 372 X-Torq. This change here was probably made somewhere back around 2014. See, I was modifying these things before I put on video for, my God, years. And I would gut the intake, knife edge that that divider between the top and the bottom. I usually would sort of favor the port. I would radius these here. And later, I started cutting this down, the skirt down, and that made a big difference, by the way. This one I did not do. This was probably one of the first ones I ever did. This came back because it got run over by a tractor. But these things modify well. And I had made some changes on the port timing on the transfers, but I'm not going to get into that now. But so those are the changes. Things like the clamps are all different because the radius of the intake port itself is all different. And here's an XPW just as a comparison. This is going back to the original editions again. New out of the box XPW, new out of the box 50mm XP. Look how clean that is, but look at how the transfers are filled in on the one side there to bring the cross-section area down. That's by design. That's why these no load around 13,000, the same as a X-Torq, because the cross-sectional area of these XPWs, the 51.4 XPWs is roughly the same as these right here, and they have roughly the same cross-sectional area in the transfer stock. And by the way, that's the same as a 48mm. They have a little smaller cross-sectional area, and I've done that in the past. And yet again, stock, the no load is down in the same range as these and the same range as these, because the 48mm have a little bit smaller transfers. Gone through that before. But what I want to do today is introduce you to the saw project. We just looked at it, but I want to introduce it, and then I want to start doing an evaluation to see what we have to work with and see how much work we have to do. But let me put this stuff away first. Let's find out whether or not we have a saw that we can turn into a running saw right here. This was given to me by Bob. This is to fill a hole in my collection. This is a small mount 2063 Jonsered. But the first thing I need to know is, does it have spark? Isn't that a good start? Let's see if we have spark. We do have spark. The next thing is, do we have compression? Look at that. We got up around 150. I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but I measured 150 pounds of compression plus spark. Why won't this saw run? I think it's going to run. So the next thing we need to do is, you got compression and spark. We need air, which goes to this air filter, and then we need gas. So there needs to be some in the tank. Alright, got a little bit of gas in there. Now, to those people who don't like primer bulbs, boo on you, because this is where the primer bulb would make a big difference, because by priming that you could make sure the gas is into the carburetor. Guaranteed that thing is dry as a bone in there, and even while I choke it, the chances of me being able to draw gas up and get that wet fast is probably pretty slim. So let me see if I got a few drips left to go right into the carburetor. Yeah, there's some. We'll see if that helps to get started. Maybe enough RPMs it'll maybe start drawing. So let's see if we have a saw. Come over here and decomp, because I'm old. Probably don't need that much gas in there, but maybe we do. Fired. Now you thought it was going to be done, right? Well, there's a bits and pieces section I have to go through a little bit. But before I do that, I need a little bit of recreation, right? A little play before work. So, let me see. See if my little... yeah, you know, 372, 370... Oh, yep, Jonsered. What we have here is a 2171. Looks pretty much like the other ones, doesn't it? This one here, I call it a 2175 because it has the Husqvarna XPW top end on it. It's a 51.4 millimeter versus the standard 50 millimeter. And it has a different ignition. Can't you see it? Should be clear as day. We'll get into that. But this one has the later version of the ignition system that are on the new X-Torques. And it starts a lot better once I made that modification. Other than that, this is a relatively unmodified saw. It just simply has the 51.4 millimeter top end, but it has a standard carburetor, muffler, X-Torque ignition, but the rest of it is pretty, you know, pretty generic. This is a stock 2172. And remember we were talking about the differences between the X-Torque saws and the original edition. Well, you can see it right here if you look careful. See how much taller that chain brake is versus the original edition? Same with the handle, same with the top cover. You know, there's a little more space right here, a little taller. And notice it has a decomp up here because of that different cylinder design as well. So this one here is also relatively stock, in the sense that the only change I made on this is I popped out those goofy nylon bearings and stuck in steel cage, and I put it together with a glue gasket versus a standard gasket. Other than that, this is stock. Good running saw. You've seen it many times in the video. And this is my modified 2165. Now the thing you're going to find interesting is this 2165 has a lot of the 2166 parts on it. So this is a case of blending the X-Torque parts with the original edition saw. And if we look at it, we'll see pretty quickly what I'm talking about. Chain brake handlebar, taller than the stock one here. That would have come with that saw. A little shorter. Yet again, these were designed with a taller cover, and the taller cover was designed for that taller X-Torque cylinder. Now, I happen to like this because it gives me more space, especially in the wintertime when I have big gloves. So but this is a case of blending the later X-Torque parts back to an original edition and coming up with something that's a blend of both that's better than either one, in my humble opinion. You might ask how come I'm going back and reviewing all this stuff. Well, I kind of had a rude wake-up call a little while back when my son came home and basically told me that all my videos suck. So I went back and started reflecting on that a little bit, and then realized that while I was doing a whole bunch of these videos about just living life, I really never put a whole lot of thought into going back and referencing those. I figured it was just sort of rambling through life and you kind of ramble on through. But God help you if you want to go back and actually find how to do anything, because there's nothing in the titles that gives you a freaking clue. So they're probably pretty close. That's how I put my bearings in, just like that. There's one. There's two.